So maybe that's our signal. We should start here. So my name is Susan Mills. I'm the moderator for the three of us. Michael Fine, Karen Lee Boren. We were going to have a fourth person who was unable to make it. So we're just going to start. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome. The three of us are going to start just by introducing ourselves, maybe a little bit about the work that we've done, how our background relates to social justice issues. And then we'll get into a more specific discussion of why fiction particularly tends to lend itself to exploring social justice issues, and about the intersection of free speech and social justice in writing, and then about what responsibilities we have as authors to audience, to research, to subject. And then we'll have a chunk of time at the end for questions from you guys. So I'm going to go last. Michael, you want to start by introducing yourself and how you see social justice intersecting with your writing?
Sure. Thanks. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be with you. My name is Michael Fine. I'm a family physician by most recent training. And some of you may remember I spent some time at the Rhode Island Department of Health. My life story is a little complicated. I started thinking I was going to be a writer, and then realized it was going to take me 10 years of writing to make a living at it, and thought I ought to find a way to be useful in the interim. So I started working as a community organizer in the South Bronx. I got trained as a community organizer, and that meant I saw the world from the perspective of communities and community organizing first. Then I actually ended up going to medical school because I thought it was a good focus for community organizing itself, and spent most of my professional career in medicine trying to be with and organize and use medicine as a way to organize communities. And that went on until I woke up one morning and found myself at the Rhode Island Department of Health, and had the opportunity in that setting to propose a way to do healthcare reform that would build us a healthcare system that was for people, not for profit. It was a really well-articulated, well-thought-out approach that's been now duplicated in a number of other states, and it got to the legislature, and it died. It died in about 12 seconds. And that was the moment at which I realized that there was no way to do any kind of policy or policy development or social justice without using the imagination. And that was the moment at which I really went back to writing full-time.
I'm Karen Lee Boren. I am a professor at Rhode Island College, and I write fiction and literary nonfiction, and scholarship, actually. And I have been writing and teaching for over 30 years, and social justice issues are a main component of much of my teaching, and in my writing I'm constantly thinking about these issues. I define social justice widely, particularly in my writing. I do my best to always keep in mind my own situatedness as a white, educated, cis female, albeit from a working-class Midwestern background. In my most recent book, I take up issues surrounding bodily autonomy, particularly those in relation to reproduction, but also in relation to war. And it's set in 1966, and take that up in terms of the draft. When I say that I think about social justice issues widely, I think that these days some people think that social justice is synonymous with issues of race, but there is a wide lens for social justice issues, and by no means are social justice issues the job of the BIPOC community alone. And so thinking about how to approach them as a middle class, cisgender, educated woman is much of the part of is as much a part of my writing and teaching as anything else is. So, yeah, that's me.
Okay. So we have professor, doctor, and lawyer here. So what really ties social...
Sounds like the beginning of a joke.
Yeah, right.
We walked into a bar and...
What ties social justice to my writing really was my background as a Spanish-speaking immigration attorney, and before that as a community activist. I ran an immigration firm in Providence and Boston areas for 20 or so years, but I retired partly in order to transform some of those stories that I had heard into fictional. I grew up in a very political household. My mother was involved in the civil rights movement in the 60s and then worked with prisoners after that. When I grew up, the purpose of life was to do social change work. My own early focus was building alternative culture as a lesbian feminist, so that was in my background as well. And then I got involved in the Central American Sanctuary Movement, lived with Central Americans as family and housemates for a number of years. As an attorney, I focused especially on asylum cases and unaccompanied minors, and because I spoke Spanish, many of our clients were from Latin America. In my book, On the Wings of a Hummingbird, one of my primary goals was to portray immigrants, and especially those who flee from their countries, as human, complex people who aren't defined by their legal status nor by their past experiences, which are often traumatic. So, just very briefly, the novel deals with a 15-year-old girl, Petra, who's growing up in a poor village in Guatemala, and draws on Mayan mythology to try to make sense of a childhood she's had a difficult childhood dealing with gang violence, domestic violence. At some point she flees to live in Providence and reunites with her mother, who had fled when she was 5 years old from domestic violence. She begins a complex reunification with her mother in Providence and begins her own healing process. I've been particularly focused on the issues in my novel recently, but as Karen said, social issues certainly include racism, sexism, heterosexism, but they include a lot more things. So my novel, I'm dealing with gang violence, not unrelated to the violence of civil war in Guatemala and elsewhere in the world. The question of how a community of victims and perpetrators comes to live together again and make some future together. There's also issues of transnational feminism, the role of myth and religion and imagination in healing, and what it's like to be an immigrant caught between two worlds, one where one can't live safely with little hope for the future, and the other where you have nothing but hope. And then there's a lot in the book about forgiveness and how that may relate to redemption for perpetrators and healing for everyone, and the concept that perpetrators often have at least as much healing to do as victims. And I would just add personally that the artistry of literature, I think, is as important to me as the social justice themes. One does not exclude the other. Still working on putting it all together. So let's see, moving on to the substance here. So the next question is, what is it about narrative, particularly fiction, that makes it an appropriate or even ideal medium for discussing, exploring, and or raising awareness of social justice issues? Michael, or
Karen. Okay.
Let me share this.
Okay. What drives people to act in one way or another? What can incite change individually, globally? For me, the stage of fiction is a place to explore so many issues of social justice because fiction requires conflict. Conflict drives plot, and plot requires writers to understand motivations for actions and understanding that requires empathy, but also political, social, emotional, and psychological drives. As some of you may recall, in my writing workshops, I define plot as a slight variation on Robert Olin Butler's concept of plot. Yearning, desire, need, want, thwarted, or challenged. and these drive characters into action. And we responsible writers put our characters into moments of decisive action where they must make choices. Choices for good, choices for bad, based on the pressures of their world, but also on their individual motivations. So fiction allows for experimentation, for following ideas to their logical conclusion, for imagining what can be, and for giving characters second chances. It's a place where you can let characters make really, really awful choices. And you don't have to deal with the consequences, your characters have to deal with the consequences. The fact is, of course, most social justice issues are issues because they are around conflict, and conflict surrounds them. That's the stuff of fiction, and I think narrative is a great place to work out those ideas, whether in realistic fiction, whether in fantasy worlds that are taking place in alternate parallel universes, whatever. I think it's a great place to make sense of things and to try to understand the world and to try to help other people understand the world in new ways.
I can't be anywhere near as eloquent as that. That said, I think about fiction and narrative from the perspective of the ability of fiction to help people see the inner lives of people who are not like them. And that, to me, is a critical function that needs to exist if democracy is going to continue to thrive. And democracy is the best way we have of addressing issues of social justice. I wrote a novel, started about 10 years ago and was published about 3 years ago, that's set half in Rhode Island and half in Liberia at the time of the Liberian Civil Wars, at the end of the Liberian Civil Wars. And I put it there because I needed Americans to look at what a real civil war looks like. It's like that smell and taste us drifting in that direction. And in the process, I think the characters are very different people. And you get to look at their inner lives and understand that we're all in this together, which is the critical place to stand if you're going to make social justice happen. And now I write lots of short stories as well as novels and some policy books. But the short stories do nothing but look at the inner lives of different people. One of the most amazing gifts that I got in the time of my both practice and work at the Department of Health was that I got to meet lots of Rhode Island's communities. People that I had never met before, communities I hadn't met before. Rhode Island is this amazing and glorious place where we have communities from all across the world. And most of us don't have the opportunity to meet people from communities that are different from our own. And so I use fiction as a way to kind of be in those communities, reflecting the voices that I've heard, so that people who read the crazy stuff I write get a sense of these human beings and how important, meaningful, complex, rich, and amazing they are, so that when we meet together at the State House, people have some sense that we're all in this together and we are all one people.
A few more thoughts, some overlapping, but about what social justice fiction writing is. It depicts and examines inequity, injustice, inequality. It explores social problems. It may put the reader into the perspective of a marginalized individual or group, creating empathy and understanding in the reader. It may interrogate power structures. And again, it involves more than just equity issues like racism, sexism, heterosexism. It may include poverty, war, the overuse of incarceration, gun violence, police violence, dehumanizing public assistance, the effects of climate change. There's innumerable social problems to deal with. But fiction plays out the issues, the moral quandaries, the complexities that we actually face in our lives. It allows people to see, despite our differences, what we have in common. The shared hopes for our future, the difficulties of daily life, the emotions that drive us. Feminism famously says that personal is political, but nowhere is that played out better than in a story. African American literature also has a tradition of entwining the personal and the political. People like Richard Wright, Zora Neale Hurston, and James Baldwin all did it very expertly. Individual stories connect to larger themes and to history, to our role as citizens. You could say with my own novel that it's about immigration or about the healing of social division caused by gangs or civil war, but on a very basic level, it's about a few sympathetic individuals dealing with their own very personal lives, their own woes and dreams. The personal is political in literature. To read a novel is to walk in another person's shoes, appreciate their inner lives with empathy. Fiction touches hearts and minds of readers. It has the potential to bring people together on opposing sides of an issue. One example I would mention by way of comparing social justice in novels and in real life, there's a novel called A Paragon. I think it's a great book by Colin McCann. And he gives voice to an Israeli and a Palestinian, very powerfully using their life stories to build a shared sense of grief and history and politics and conflict. And then in the real life side, in Israel, there's projects that bring together Israelis and Palestinians to get to know each other in a more personal way. And I was just thinking about the difference between those two. Novels have a certain advantage over meeting people in person because you don't have to spend as much time getting to know the person before they open up. You can better see through their justifications and rationalizations and defenses. Personal meetings can be incredibly useful, but it's hard to go very deep with another person while you're getting together only briefly. And in a novel, the author presents a moral problem, shows the protagonist's journey to reach a solution, and then lots of readers can more readily, quote, meet the same person and see the same struggles. I just want to quote Obama before I'm done because he's got a great quote on reading and social justice. He said, "When I think about how I understand my role as a citizen, the most important stuff I've learned, I think I've learned from novels. It has to do with empathy. It has to do with being comfortable with the notion that the world is complicated and full of grays, but there's still truth to be found, and that you have to strive for that and work for that, and the notion that it's possible to connect with someone else even though they're very different from you." Unquote. And I would just say that this process is absolutely central to social justice and social change. Okay, next question.
Could I just add one thing?
Yes.
My students have heard me say this before, so you can not listen, but I'd just like to point out that fiction is special. Fiction is unique. The thing about fiction is you can get closer to a fictional character in a book than you can get to any other living human being in the world. So think about the person you know best, love best in the world, who knows you best. You cannot get inside their head and know what they're thinking at all times and see the world through their eyes, use the language and articulation that they would use. That's one of the reasons that fiction is such a powerful tool, and it's one of the only art mediums that does that. You can't do that in film, you can't do that in stage, you can't do it in video or video games, you cannot be inside the thoughts of another character. And I just think that's one of the reasons it's so powerful for allowing people to think more widely about experience. It's not going to die. That's why it's not going to die as well.
And can I add that I think the history of literature as we know it is wrapped up with social justice. I mean, the great books that I grew up reading were all in their hearts about social justice, going back to Victor Hugo and Tolstoy and, everybody who matters to me. That's what it's all about. And I wonder about the extent to which those great writers gave us a perspective that we call social justice to begin with. How they used their imaginations to let us see that there is another pathway and do it differently than we've done it before.
Nice. So then that leads right into the next one. How do we deal with the intersection of free speech and social justice?
I think it's a huge challenge in a lot of ways. I mean, I think free speech is critical to our discourse, and I think it needs to be defended every place and in every way that it can be. I think that those of us who are writing, have to be really conscious of what we're writing and who we're writing about and the communities that those people live in, and to address those communities with deep respect. And so we have to use our free speech, but use it honorably and responsibly, and work really hard to make sure that we use that free speech and also respect those communities and those people, because they're our future.
I think I'm going to throw it over to the lawyer.
Yeah. This is something that I've thought about a lot. Yeah, so there's the issue of cultural appropriation, and less judgmentally put, writing across difference, and its intersections with free speech. So very central to my novel, On the Wings of Hummingbird, because it's written by me, a white U.S.-born woman, in the voice of a 15-year-old Guatemalan girl with Mayan ancestry. So yes, I'm going to be controversial here and defend writing across difference. I believe that the more people who respectfully and knowledgeably write about these issues, the better. But respectful and knowledgeable are key terms. Not approving of white people writing BIPOC, hopefully Black, Indigenous, people of color, roles means that we give over the entire responsibility for portraying BIPOC people. And there must be a role, I believe, for allies, especially to reach white people around similar issues. If white writers write only about what they know best, and so their stories revolve entirely around all white communities for white audiences, it's not realistic. It's a cop-out, I think. For me personally, it would also be soul-crushing, I think, to be forbidden to use BIPOC voices, as these issues are things that are central to my heart and what I grew up with, what I built my life around. And it would certainly chill my own creativity, I think. I've noticed that one hears few complaints about when authors do their job well. So just to throw out a couple of examples, Isabel Allende wrote Island Beneath the Sea, a Chilean writer writing about the history of Haiti and the slave rebellion. Anne Patchett, Bel Canto, white author, she writes about Peruvian guerrillas. And in the more classics realm, John Steinbeck famously wrote Graves of Wrath, or Tia Flat, Pearl, lots of things in other people's voices. There's a long list. So I do want to acknowledge a downside to writing across difference. I'd be the first to admit that when I write a Guatemalan girl in a poor village in Guatemala, there's a level of nuance that I will never be able to fully represent. It would be a different story if it was written by an author from a poor village in Guatemala. Undoubtedly in some ways better and probably in some ways worse, but different for sure. My story is just one small contribution to literary canon, and I hope the effect is to bring in as many readers as possible. But even if the point of view is not a BIPOC character, it's likely that other characters will be, and that requires just as much research or experience by the author. And if there are no BIPOC characters in books written by white people, we'd be missing reality. So a compromise position is paying, and I emphasize paying, professional sensitivity readers as part of editing a work. I can have a whole other conversation about the pros and cons of this, but for now I just leave it as I think that's a reasonable compromise. From my perspective as the author of Hummingbird book, I think readers should be aware, I personally think that readers should be aware of who the author is, something about their background. In academia I was taught that that's an essential part of evaluating any writing, but I have to say that I can see the reverse. Toni Morrison powerfully stated that she doesn't want to be read as a black woman writer, just as a writer. Her work evaluated on its own merit. So I think there's validity to both sides of that. Of course, white authors have long been privileged in the publishing world over black and Latino and immigrant authors, absolutely. We need to elevate and make room for non-white authors. And assuming that there's only so many books that can be published, this probably means that more good BIPOC writers will make it and fewer lesser quality white authors will make it. And there's nothing wrong with that, that's as it should always have been. But a diverse set of voices, including white people, only has that much greater chance of reaching a wider audience. And authors, editors, publishers should absolutely be discerning as to whether representations are respectful and realistic. Established white authors can very much help underrepresented newer authors, but I think generally speaking it's editors, publishers, reviewers, marketers who need to change more fundamentally. And then a very important part of it is consumers, because unless consumers read these things and their tastes and interests change respectively, diverse authors will go nowhere. Personally, I suspect that no matter how much the publishing industry changes, BIPOC authors will still remain underrepresented, especially poor and working class representatives. As long as race is so closely correlated with class and education, writing takes time and quiet space, which is much more available to those with a certain amount of money. And that's not something that's going to change overnight. So just to tie it back in with free speech, a novel, in my mind, is very much a part of a process, not an end. No one has the right answer about much of anything. A novel represents a point of reflection, not a didactic, this is the way it is product. One more voice added to the mixture of humanity and its challenges. One more opportunity to take 2 steps forward or maybe 1 step back, but always to turn thoughts around. It's part of the marketplace of ideas, some worthy, some less so, but all part of the process. And to me, this marketplace of ideas is the bedrock of free speech. With all its errors and offensiveness, it's the best thing we have in an inevitably imperfect world as we struggle towards something better, all of us. So for me, it comes down to that people should write what they're inspired to write. Do it well. And just based on how complicated this discussion gets, doing otherwise seems to me will inevitably tie people up in knots and stifle creativity and empathy and free expression. So probably the most important part is that this discussion continue respectfully.
And one more thing to add, as I thought of as you were talking, is the notion of approaching the writing that we all do with humility. Not assuming we know the answer, but assuming we don't.
Right.
And that helps. Kind of, it gives you the opportunity to be curious, to learn, and hopefully not to screw up too much.
Karen.
Well, just a couple of things. I think that it's fair to ask a writer to think about what stories they have a right to tell. But I think it's up to the writer to decide what stories they have a right to tell. That doesn't mean that people have to like it or be happy about it. But I do think that it is up to the writer to be responsible in making those choices. And so when I wrote my first book, which took place in the neighborhood that I grew up in, very kind of similar aspects to an event that happened in my neighborhood growing up that was really traumatizing to, I think, the entire neighborhood. And even my family. My sister wouldn't sleep with her back to the door for years because of something that happened. It happened to a community. And so 30 years later, I wrote a book about it. And I was doing a book tour, not in the city that I was in, but the book is set south of Milwaukee, and I was in Minneapolis at a bookstore. And I came into the bookstore and I was greeted with a hate bouquet by someone who had been involved in the original incident. And it was signed by one of my characters, which I thought was a nice touch. And it said that I needed to learn compassion. Now the book had just come out and it was pretty clear that this person hadn't read my book yet. But I had spent 1.5 years of my life going every day to this story to imagine what it would be like to be in the various positions that the characters were in. And to me, that was the definition of compassion, is to spend that much time actually thinking about the pain that someone would have gone through in that situation. And I did not think that I depicted it with something other than respect and thoughtfulness and a depth of presentation that would allow someone else to feel that emotional experience. And I believe it was also my story to tell because it was my neighborhood and my community, and it did have a ripple effect. But that didn't make this woman and her family any happier. And they made that very clear. And that is the definition of free speech, because I was able to tell my story, that story in my way, from my perspective, and they are quite welcome to not like it and to say that they don't think that I was compassionate. Rather, they read it first before they said that, but they don't have to. And the other thing I think about is Salman Rushdie. Guy writes a book and has to go into hiding for 10 years. Serious hiding for 10 years. And then apologizes for the work that he wrote, manages to come to some kind of understanding where he can go back to his life and continue writing. And then he's giving a speech about free speech and is stabbed in the neck for it. I also think about his story at the auction of the ruby slippers, which is where the ruby slippers from the Wizard of Oz are being auctioned off. And a group wants to buy them, to destroy them because of their devilish power. And so, he has written this story to work out his ideas about is there a limit to tolerance? Do we have to tolerate hate groups? Do we have to tolerate hate speech? Is it unfettered? Should it be unfettered? Is that an issue of free speech? We're dealing with that in other ways that I'm sure I don't have to mention. But I think the thing about free speech is that it's living, and it's something that is alive, and we have to keep thinking about what it means and what it is. And I don't claim to have the answers, but
nor does anybody else.
I think it's worth thinking about.
Thanks. So Karen, I'd just like to invite you to continue here. The next question, what are the challenges to the writer in terms of craft, who goes into a writing project with social justice goals in mind?
I think the biggest challenge is to remember that you're telling a story. It's really easy to get very excited about your research. It's really fun to put in all of the research, but you're telling a story and being subtle and thoughtful, putting in what the reader needs to know, not what the writer needs to know. Writer's going to need to know a lot more about any issue, but that the craft of it is to tell the story and to use all of the elements of storytelling to think about how to engage your reader and pull your reader in, while at the same time working out these issues in a book. Fiction lives in the gray areas, not in the black and white areas. And propaganda is not the same thing as fiction. And so I think that is a challenge that we have as writers, not to tell our readers what to think, but instead to complicate issues that they may already have formed opinions on.
Okay. Do you want to say something on that one?
Sure. Karen knows the craft stuff way better than I do. I'm a relative amateur by comparison. But I think the way the need for writing about, or when you're writing about social justice issues, when it comes to craft, the important thing is not to change the craft in the service of the social justice, but to make the writing the very best it can be, so that it serves those social justice issues well. And I'm going to tell a by analogy story. I get to talk to a fair numbers of residents and interns in training about how to do advocacy, social advocacy inside healthcare and medicine. And I tell them all the same thing, which is the first thing you have to do is be way better at medicine than anybody around you. Because somebody's going to come after you at some point. And if you know your medicine, you're going to be in good shape. You're going to be able to do that kind of social advocacy because you know your medicine. And I think the same thing is true about writing. If you write well, if you write clearly, if you use discipline and focus, and think about plot development and think about character development and do it really well, then you serve the social justice issues best. Simple as that.
Thanks. The last question. We have this, so what are the responsibilities of writers in taking up social justice issues in their work? To the subject, to the audience, to the use of historical materials like other research, and who is our audience? First, Michael?
Sure. Well, I think our audience is everybody. And if you're good at it, the idea is that the audience develops and develops well. I think the main responsibility is to never give up, to take the things that make you mad and write about them, open them up, expose them, turn them around, think about them critically and well, and think about the perspective of people you're likely to disagree with, so you can understand them, develop empathy for them, and bring them into the discussion by helping them feel heard. When I start, I write a short story a month, and I've been doing that now for 4 or 5 years. And I often start the short stories I write, which I usually get started about something that ticks me off, that's happening in the world. I often start with the perspective of the other to make sure that I'm hearing the other perspective, bring them in, and then make sure that we can together get to a place that's different from the place where we are now, where we have 450 some odd people sleeping on the street in tents and people sleeping in front of the State House. That's the kind of stuff we need to keep in our focus and never quit.
Well, broadly, I would say that I spent a lot of years thinking about this, but my responsibility, as I now believe it, is to keep figuring out what my responsibility is as I go along, and not to think that I know yet what it is. But I think on the most sort of basic practical levels, I think you have to do your research, and you have to do your research widely if you're going to write about a subject. And it doesn't matter if that subject is, a civil war, or that subject is polka music, as in my case. If that subject is adolescence, for me, it will take a great deal of research if I am going to write a contemporary character who is 15, because I'm not, and I don't have a 15-year-old. I think of Grace Paley, who used to ride the buses in New York and sit near young people so that she could get their vernacular right. I think thinking about the fact that you have to do your research all the time about every aspect of it. You have to read the things you don't like because you're going to have a character who represents the other side of your issue or whatever. So I think continuing to research and continuing to think about things to make sure that you aren't writing someone else's story without realizing it, because they've already written it. And if that's the case, to read that and then make sure that you're not telling a story that, plagiarizing someone. And I think just being aware that you are writing about people, even if you're not writing human people, you're still writing, emotion and And I don't take that idea of compassion and empathy lightly. It is a responsibility to be a writer, to ask someone to deny their world in favor of your world for even a short period of time. You have to give them something that's worth reading.
I'm going to repeat a little bit in different words, but I just hope that we never fall into stereotypes and platitudes and either politically conscious or otherwise, left or right, it doesn't matter. At the same time, I think we always need to realize that we're one voice among many, and there's no perfect story to represent any issue. It seems to me that there's some conflict, but there's an old maxim for writers, write what you know. It seems like there's some conflict with that, because we, meaning white people in my case, are the dominant and majority racial group. It's too easy for white people to interact little with non-whites. And if whites are going to represent the complexity, the diversity, the beauty that is real life, we need to develop a functional level of race literacy. And so learn how BIPOC people or LGBTQ people or whatever group experience the world somewhat differently. And I just think it's too easy to bypass difficult subjects because we haven't fully lived it. White writers need to write about communities as they are and not pretend that we all exist in all white environments. And the white experience doesn't have to be the center of every depiction. Writing social justice hopefully opens up more readers to the diversity of cultures in our country. And so I guess in the end I would say don't simply write what you know. Writing is definitely not easy and comfortable, and nor does what you write about have to be in your zone of comfort. It does have to be responsibly researched, and you know, there's a line there. It's a complicated problem. And I do think it's actually futile to suggest that culture can't be borrowed by people in power from those who are not. And pointless, given that the diversity of cultures has always infused and will continue to infuse mainstream American music, dance, cinema, poetry, fiction, everything. I think, you know, part of what people can do is network with other people writing on similar topics, with people in expertise in subjects that you write about, with communities you're writing about. Mostly talk to real people. And hopefully being a writer gives you more reason to do that. Responsibility to the audience. Our role as a writer is to portray characters in certain situations, maybe put readers in where they haven't been before. But again, not to present conclusions, not to convey political ideology, but perhaps yes, to point out how a social problem affects individuals, not to bang their heads over their heads with solutions. And I hope that readers will be exposed more and more to a greater diversity of stories, once that includes the experiences of all of us. I hope that BIPOC, LGBTQ people, and others will start seeing themselves represented more often in literature. And we should never assume that our audience is straight, white, male, whatever. I think it's human nature to want to create and absorb and learn from stories. The idea that only Black, Latino, Indigenous people should depict BIPOC people in art and fiction ignores that part of us by forbidding empathy and even admiration that can motivate respectful attempts to create a literary character. We're looking for stories that people relate to. All of us. So, let's see. You guys feel free to comment, talk about anything, and we want to open it up, I think, to questions.
Questions and comments.
Yeah.
Anybody else might have to say?
Thanks. So, I appreciate you talking about research. I think research is so important. I also think, like, meeting with people who are going through exactly what you're depicting, and having conversations with them. How do you compile questions or go about starting a conversation like that and reaching out to people?
Well, my experience is that that often one or two questions that are not yes or no questions allow, and then listening is really the way to go about that. And I think it probably depends on the kind of thing that you're writing, where you might begin. Reading is a good place, but then maybe reaching out to someone who has written about their own experiences and therefore is already open to talking about it. I think people are happy. It's amazing how many people will respond to you when you just reach out to them and say, I'm interested in writing about this. I wonder if you would mind talking about that. And they may be able to point you to someone else. Just beginning to follow a trail, I think. And thinking about the questions respectfully as well. Always giving someone an opportunity to tell their story instead of talking over them. I was recently reading a bunch of interviews, writers interviewing writers, and it was actually ZZ Packer, who, the terrific writer, who said that she was really bad at this because she was supposed to be the interviewee and she always ended up just talking. And then I looked at on the page how much ZZ Packer talked and how much, I don't even remember what the other writer was. The other writer had actually responded, and it was like ZZ Packer and this much response, and ZZ Packer and this much response. Ideally, you want that balance to be the other way around.
Yeah, I actually think it's about hanging out. I love the Grace Valley story. I have unusual privilege in that way, in that I got to spend 30 years listening to people talking exam rooms, and would ask questions about their lives. So I got to sort of meet people, hear their voices, and then their voices show up in the stuff I write. And my aim is to be true to their voices, because those voices stick in my head. But I think the research is being in those communities, being with people who you might not be with other ways, and just listen. Exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that the danger is to make any one person or 5 people or whatever represent something. Each person represents themselves. They don't, 5 black people don't represent African Americans. 5 lesbians don't represent LGBTQ people, whatever. But I think, yeah, so I kind of agree with what Michael's saying. It's a matter of putting yourself in that context, and the question is so dependent on what kind of people you're writing about. But if I was to think about Latino people, you want to have a secondary character, say that's Latino, and you don't have that much in your experience. I would look for a way to put myself in a group of people, like teach an ESL class, or go to a community center and volunteer. Something where you're not just with one person, but you get to experience a group and potentially interact with a lot of people.
Thank you.
Anything else? Questions?
Somebody think we were really wrong about something? No? Then we didn't say the right stuff.
Yeah, there's some controversial things that we said, so.
All right. So how do you deal with social justice when somebody else doesn't think like one person's social justice could be another person's social injustice. One person's truth could be another person's not necessarily lie, but falsity. So how do you compound that?
Well, this is why I say that fiction exists in the gray areas of that. And, every situation has many and multiple perspectives. So you might have those extremes, but then what's in between all of that? Who are the people, in the most basic experience of like a car accident? You have 2 cars coming from each direction, they each think, it's the other person's fault. Well, maybe those aren't the first people that, or the only people that you ask. Maybe you ask the people on street who saw it from this angle and that angle and this angle, and you get multiple perspectives. And I'm not sure that every work of fiction needs to find the answer or present the answer either. Often it's enough to present the question for the reader to begin thinking about the answer or where they land on something. I mean, it would be so much easier to solve social justice issues if they were clear-cut and black and white. And yet, of course, that's not the case, because they involve human emotion and they involve complexities of culture. The Latinx community is not a monolith. The white community is not a monolith. The African American community and any of those communities, we're not monolithic people. My family doesn't all think the same on every single issue. But on paper, we're all really similar. People, we don't even think the same. About that time, my sister swiped my toy and my Barbie and got a tear up. You know, I mean, even something that small. So bigger issues, I think it's just, I think you have to find the gray areas.
And I think it's accepting that I don't know the answer about what social justice and what isn't. I often, usually start short stories not knowing where it's going to end up, and letting the characters guide me. And at the end of the day, I think what I find in my own short stories is how people work through their differences and find a way to live together. I mean, that's the meat of the story when you get it right there. And what that is kind of a reification of the process of democracy itself, how we learn to live together. And telling those stories and figuring out how people learn to live together, that helps us build and sustain democracy. And that's the central pathway to social justice itself. Not, this is the solution to this problem, and this is the solution to that problem. It's how we are together as human beings, and fiction helps us figure that out.
I think that it's certainly true that the three of us come at these social justices, writing social justice, from a sort of leftward side. And I can imagine that among the Proud Boys, there's also fiction writers, right? And I guess I would just hope that they would apply the same rules, there's gray areas and representing people with different sides sympathetically. I know that, from my perspective in writing about Guatemala, for instance, there's bad guys in a lot of stories, right? So I have a gang leader who causes a lot of harm in this community in Guatemala. And I personally, I come from a background of advocating for prisoners, so I find a lot of sympathy in what got him to that place and where he's coming from. And then there's a character who's from the courthouse in Guatemala who is very patriotic and believes that the way to move Guatemala forward is to kill or imprison the leftists. Right? And it's hard to be sympathetic with that kind of point of view, but at least you can look at where they come from, what got them there. And I think, the bad guys are humans as well. They're not one-dimensional characters. And I don't know what it's like to write fiction as a Proud Boy, but...
Yeah, but now you've got me thinking about how to try.
Right. Anything else? Questions? We've got time for one or two more questions.
I've got a question about just the writing craft. So let's say you pick a social justice issue that you're concerned with, whether it's incarceration or whether it's LGBTQ or environment. How do you actually approach that? Do you do the research first, or like a lot of research, or do you do a detailed outline and then do the research to fill in the outline? Or how do you go about that craft of starting to finishing a novel?
Karen, you're the craft person.
Well, I would say figure out what interests you first, and begin to find your characters and your voice. And the way that you find your inspiration, my graduate students are writing about their inspiration for our class on Tuesday. That's going to be really different for every person. Some people will be inspired by just having an experience. Some people will be inspired by hearing a voice or an image. Some people will have a full-blown story in mind. Some people have the end of the story first. John Irving famously never begins a book until he's written the final line. And he never changes the final line. And so he writes to that for the entire thing. Toni Morrison says that would bore her. And so she would be what we so lovingly call a pantser, which is that she writes by the seat of her pants. I'm a little bit of a pantser insofar as I begin writing something and then I do research as I feel I need to know about something. And it can be anything. I mean, I had to research 60s music, and to my hope, there is not a single song in my novel that did not come out in 1966 by the date of the novel. You know, so it's not just, oh, what are the big hits of the 60s? You know, I wanted a deep dive, I wanted to be accurate. But, you know, it's sort of what inspires you is going to be different. But the crafting of a novel is a slightly different thing because it requires a structure, and figuring out how to do that structure so that you don't collapse in the middle, I think, is one of the key things that you learn by writing novels. And recognizing what the novel structure is, and that research, I would say, reads novels and analyze them for their structures. Actually break it down. How many subplots are there? How many characters are there? What is the overarching dramatic question? What are the smaller dramatic questions that are being answered along the way? And it's really, you know, learning maybe a little bit about novel structure. The structure is a great thing to be able to hang your hat on. And break it afterwards.
I'm a stumbler, not an answer. That is something that ticks me off. I get an idea, I start working on it, and then I figure out what I have to know in order to be credible, and in order to address it intelligently, so I research as I go. And I do a lot of research as I go. And I learn a lot, and that's what I like.
Yeah, me too. I think research is one of the funnest parts of being a writer. I drove Route 66 as part of my research. I went to the middle of Wisconsin and went to a dairy farm. You know, it's the funnest part of being a writer. Then you got to go sit in a room alone.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, thinking about writing BIPOC characters or people you don't know, people you don't experience, I don't know if any of you have ever used one, or do you have any opinions on using sensitivity readers?
Yeah, I brought that up. I personally find it a little bit controversial as an idea, but maybe perhaps necessary.
Yeah, I'm sorry I missed that.
That's
and I'm also wondering what your opinion on all the controversy that swirled around American Dirt when it first came out.
So maybe I could start with that. American Dirt came out, and I was about 3/4 of the way through writing my book, and I'm like, oh, this is a big issue here. I think one of the big issues in terms of that book was really how she was treated as an author by the publisher, and she was offered this huge contract, and a huge contract had rarely been offered to a BIPOC person. So I think there was just inequity probably there right from the beginning. I haven't read the book. It seems to me that what people object to in the book are pretty small, picky things, and that she basically did a pretty good job for the kind of book she was doing, and that it reaches a particular audience, which is great. She's probably not going to have a lot of Mexican-American readers, is my guess, but she'll get the people who like adventure stories, Indiana Jones kind of. More power to her.
Yeah.
It's the publishing industry in that case that I think needs to move.
I would have a maybe slightly different. I would maybe have a slightly different take on it. She got, I think, a 7-figure. She got an amazing amount of money. And if you are going to get that kind of money for something that you're writing, then certainly you know that you're going to be on an enormous stage. And thinking about what that means in terms of appropriation, I think is really pretty important. She didn't necessarily go into that with the plan to give any of that profit to any groups that would be mentioned in the book. And that is on her, I think.
Yeah.
That is something that she should have or could have done. She didn't necessarily use it as a vehicle to bring to light the social justice issues there. She did write it for profit, and I think would have been very happy to take the fame and fortune that went with it, which would have been considerable, and was going to be considerable. With great wealth.
We've reached the end of our time as people try and come into the next one.
Just a final thing. With great wealth comes great responsibility. Absolutely.
Batman.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everybody.